Awesome. Okay. So welcome everybody to pre-eval number 5 we're on now. So today we're going to really focus in on setting your scope through picking your evaluation purpose and your questions. So in the past pre-evals, we've talked a little bit about some of the first steps you'll go through, like a theory of change, a logic model, stakeholder mapping. And so now we're going to get into a little bit more of the evaluation specific kind of content that really, it's kind of where your evaluation starts, I think, is where you do your purpose and questions. The rest of the stuff you might have already had do your program development, but this part is kind of getting into the meat and potatoes. So with that, I will pass it over to Jason.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kirsty. And thanks everybody for coming once again. So as Kirsty mentioned, today we're going to talk a lot about developing an evaluation within the scope and resources that you actually have available to you. I found over the years, one of the things that makes people reluctant sometimes to do evaluation is they get overwhelmed with thinking about all of the things that need to go into an evaluation. And I don't blame them. And especially, I mean, we do courses like this or where we talk about all of the things you need to think about in doing an evaluation. And that can, I mean, I can see how that could seem overwhelming, especially if this is something that you're doing off the side of your desk. And so hopefully what we'll do today is talk about how to actually do an evaluation, considering the resources that you actually have at hand. And so one of the key points that I want to emphasize throughout this, and I'll kind of keep coming back to this, is really one of the first stages in this is, think about what you actually have available already. For lots of organizations, you're already collecting tons and tons of stuff. And whether these are intake forms, whether they're progress updates, whether they're interviews, like formal or informal interviews, staff meetings, other things, there's lots of situations where data is being gathered, or at least there's opportunities for gathering data. And so one of the places before, I mean, even getting into thinking about, okay, we need to create a survey, or we need to do like a focus group, or we got to have some sort of innovative type of methodology that we approach. It seems like low-hanging fruit, and I think because in a lot of ways it is look and see what's already happening. And is there something that's already happening that could be either just used straight up or repurposed or modified to help you to gather information to answer your evaluation questions? Now, in addition to that, I mean, one of the things that you might also want to look at is, even if you need to, come up with new ways of gathering information. So for example, if you're not collecting the data you need to be able to answer the questions that you have, maybe you've got a process in place. And what you can do is either, hitchhike on that process or piggyback on that process. And so, if it's a focus group, if you're already holding a staff meeting, right, you don't have to hold a whole separate meeting. Maybe you could just allocate some of the time that you've dedicated for the staff meeting to having a discussion about some particular topic. Other things, I mean, that you might want to think about as well is there's no one right way how to collect data and to do an evaluation. And so give yourself license to be creative in terms of how you do this. And so, I mean, one of the things we find a lot, the go-to is like surveys. So we got to create surveys. And part of the reason why is, I mean, with Google Forms and other things, it's cheap to create them. It's an easy way to gather information, but there is also the risk of survey fatigue that happens with lots of people and lots of organizations. And so maybe there's a better way to get the information that you need. And so again, in considering, the types of things that you're doing already, the types of processes that you have in place already, but then also giving yourself license to move away from the standard things if you think that would be more useful in certain situations to gather data. And so, I mean, in a webinar that we have, I don't know which one it is, Kirsty, we're going to talk a little bit about some alternative methods, some arts-based methods to gather data, things like photo voice or other types of things. So stay tuned. We've got some ideas about some different creative things. But ultimately, again, part of this has to go back to what do you actually have the capacity to do? And so if, for example, you're collecting reams and reams and reams of qualitative data, one of the questions you might ask yourself realistically is, who's going to analyze the data? And if the answer is nobody, then you might question, like, why are we collecting this data then? Or what do we plan to do with this data? And then revise it and ask only those questions that you actually can use in terms of your evaluation. Um, so with that as kind of a preamble, one of the things that I want to talk about today then is, I mean, one of the ways that we can kind of restrict our evaluation, or at least restrict the scope of our evaluation, is coming up with a really good purpose for our evaluation. And I want to draw you back to some of the stuff we talked about in our previous webinar when we're talking about logic models and theory of change. And as we mentioned in that webinar, these are really useful tools, especially in program planning, when we're trying to make connections between the things that or the resources we have, the things that we do, and what we expect to happen as a result of all of the stuff that we do. One of the things that we can do once we've set up a nice logic model, or we've developed a coherent theory of change, is we can start to pull off pieces of that logic model for evaluation. And one of the cautions that we talked about in the previous webinar was sometimes, a program logic model and an evaluation plan get conflated as if they're the same thing. And so, I mean, if you think about your programs, for example, there's probably lots and lots and lots of things that you do. And so an evaluation could be at that program level where you're trying to evaluate all the stuff that you do and all of the impacts that you expect to happen. That's a huge process for a lot of organizations. It's big, and you just simply may not have the time nor the capacity to do that. So it's okay, and it's standard practice, and we do this a lot, to pick and choose what are the most important things that I want to do an evaluation on within this overall logic model. And so that's where this purpose comes in handy, where I can say, okay, for the purposes of this evaluation, what is it specifically that I want to gather information on? So what the purpose is, as it says here, it's a clear and succinct statement of the intent and anticipated use of our evaluation. Now, why I think this is so important at the beginning stages of an evaluation is I think it really does set the scope for what you're going to look at. And so if we're talking about what you have the resources to do, I can't emphasize enough how important this step is just to keep things within scope, because it's really, really, really easy to see scope creep come into our evaluations, especially if you're doing this in collaboration with lots of different people. And I've done lots of these where you sit down in a group, in a committee, and you try to come up with an evaluation, and everybody has wonderful ideas. And at the end of your committee meeting, your evaluation that was like, a 5-question survey now is like a 400-question survey that's going to take, millions of dollars to implement and evaluate. And then after the fact, trying to whittle it down to, what are we actually going to do becomes really hard, because all the questions are great, right? And it's all going to be great information, important and useful information. And so being able to have that purpose statement to fall back on and to look at and sort of say, okay, so while all of this is great information, how much of this actually helps us to address the purpose that we've stated in our purpose statement? And so that can be one method to keep the scope where you need it to be in order to actually conduct a useful evaluation, especially, again, if you have constrained resources or if you have like limits in time to be able to do this. So some of the most effective purposes are developed in collaboration. So again, if you take that time up front, instead of just sort of jumping in and starting to develop evaluation, like survey questions and things like that, if you take the time to collaboratively work on, a purpose statement that will address the things that you need to address, if you make sure that it's clearly worded, right? We want to get away from the ambiguity in our purpose statements. We want to know exactly what it is that we are trying to do, okay? That we want to make sure we get input from all our stakeholders. But again, if you start at the survey, this is where it becomes messy and just starts to blow up huge. But if you start with a collaboration at this point and say, like, we'll work on the survey stuff later if we decide to go with the survey route. But right now, let's just decide on what the actual purpose of this evaluation is. then that's going to be, I think, the most useful way that you can spend your limited resources and your limited time in coming up with like a coherent purpose statement. And if you think about some of the previous webinars we've done, we also, in terms of thinking about the purpose, we introduced some concepts like summative, formative, developmental evaluation. And so thinking about these kinds of things can also help in refining that purpose statement. Remember, summative, the purpose of a summative is to look and see whether or not you've achieved whatever goals that you set. Okay, formative, the purpose is typically improvement. Developmental, part of this is new programs that we don't actually know what to expect. And so part of the developmental evaluation, the purpose is to examine or explore how things change over time, right? Or how things develop over time. And so having those in mind as you're thinking about this, as you're thinking about your purpose, will be useful in thinking, okay, what is it actually that we're trying to do, right? And if part of the evaluation is, funder A said, I need to come up with an evaluation plan to explain how well I used the $5 million they gave me in the past year, that's going to define a little bit, like maybe it needs to be more summative in that respect. The other thing that I would say with these as well as kind of just a reminder when we talked about this is, although evaluations can be and often are generally summative or formative or developmental, there's also combinations. And so you can have a summative evaluation with formative aspects of it. And you can have a developmental evaluation that also has formative purposes, as part of the process involved in that. So again, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of decision. But again, having those things in mind will help you refine your purpose and think about what actually it is that you're trying to do and accomplish within your evaluation. So one of the useful tools, or one of the things that I found is a useful tool, is a little bit of a rubric here that some of our colleagues out of Waterloo developed, and we worked with them, on a project in doing workshops on evaluation capacity. And this is one of the tools that they use, and I actually really like it as a tool to, especially if you're just starting on developing a purpose statement, to kind of help guide you in kind of filling in the different pieces of this. And so what I want to do is just walk through the different elements of this. And again, the way that I think this is used best is, this is a useful guideline. If at the end of the day you use this in your purpose statement, doesn't quite fit this exactly, like that's totally fine. But I think at least as a starting point, this is a great tool to use to kind of constrain your thinking and really to ask those questions like we were just talking about, is what is the actual purpose of this? Like, what do we want to actually come out of this with? And what's the goal of this particular evaluation? So if you look at the light blue square on the top left there. So the first part of this is, again, really that succinct. Remember, we talked about clear language. We just laid out what the purpose of this evaluation is to, okay? And so we always start with our purpose and say, that's kind of where we're coming back to. Then we include some form of a verb, right? Evaluate, understand, explore, insert whatever verb is appropriate here. Okay. The third sort of, I don't know if that's black or dark blue, big square. We enter in here the scope, the target, the audience for our evaluation. So remember, we talked like stakeholder map, where we talk about like who is the primary target for this, right? So if I was doing an evaluation, again, looking at, doing an evaluation of this pre-eval webinar series, I might develop this to say the purpose of this evaluation is to determine, would be my verb, whether the participants in the pre-eval webinar series, right? So that's my target audience, right? Understand what I'm saying. Okay, so that's my blue square, my dark blue square there. Okay, then I've got another piece here, in order to, okay, and then the final piece of this is what you're going to use it for, right? And so my purpose in my little one might be, purpose of the evaluation is to, I don't even know what the verb I use, but understand the whatever experiences of the participants in the pre-eval webinar series in order to make improvements to ensure that the pre-eval webinar series is meeting people's needs. Bang, got a purpose statement. So this is where I think this kind of a tool can come in handy, is if you're working in a collaborative group this is nice. You can sit down and say, okay, we need to come up with a verb. What's the verb that best describes what it is that we actually want to accomplish? Again, like evaluate, understand, explore, determine, figure out. It's not really a verb, but so that's where we can kind of get down to that. Then we figure out who it is we want to talk about that, and then to what end. Okay, so again, here's an example, and again, we could have summative, we could have formative, we could have developmental, we could have a combination of both. Here's an example of a developmental purpose statement. So the purpose of this evaluation is to create, and so again, you see here verb here that really relates to a developmental kind of evaluation, an ongoing evidence-based forum, and stimulate the working together project partners. Okay, so this is then the scope, target, and focus of the evaluation in order to, and then in the yellow, here is what we plan to use it for, in order to develop innovative approaches to improving the vocational and language skills of the refugees in the workplace. Okay, and again, so part of what I would do then as an organization is sit down as a first step in this and really hammer out what is it that we want to accomplish, right? What's the scope that we're going to try to address in this case. All right, let's go on to the next one. So here's another example, an actual example of a purpose statement. This was created by Big Brothers Big Sisters in our U-Eval course that we ran back in June of last year. And so in this particular one, again, you see the key pieces there. Okay, so the purpose of the evaluation is to, their verb is understand. So that's what they want to be able to do. The effectiveness of virtual mentoring activities for children and youth. Okay, that's the scope, I mean, who they're going to target and for what. Okay, in order to, and here's what they want to happen, right? To make decisions about continued delivery, feasibility, and sustainability. And so again, what you see in here is all of the key elements that are going to help them constrain their evaluation. And so when they're making decisions about, okay, so should we include this? Should we not include this? What are the key questions we want to have in here? They can keep coming back to this purpose statement and saying, does the question that we're coming up with actually address this purpose statement? If not, okay, that's great. We might, put that on a parking lot for a later time. But for now, we're just going to focus on this. And so again, just to reiterate myself again, if you're working with, which we all are, limited resources, limited time, okay, this can really help in constraining that down to something that's actually manageable and doable. All right.
So after you've developed your purpose statement, you can then move to determining your evaluation questions. I like to think of like your purpose statement almost like as if it's your title, and your evaluation questions as your subheadings or the next piece to it. So the evaluation questions are the broad overarching questions that the evaluation will address, and they will stem from that purpose statement. Your purpose statement will guide the kinds of evaluation questions you ask, and then by answering those evaluation questions, you automatically address your purpose. So the two are interconnected, and they both feed into each other. So these evaluation questions are really important because they provide a direction and focus to your evaluation, just like your purpose statement. They just get a little bit deeper into it, and a little bit more specific. So without them, your evaluation can be a bit all over the place, and you start to address a little bit of everything instead of having that deep dive into those areas that you really need to know more about. And also, if you don't have those specific evaluation questions, it can be really frustrating when you start to develop those data collection tools, like we were talking about the surveys and the interview guides, because you won't know what kind of questions to ask, and there'll just be an endless amount of possibilities and an endless amount of questions that you could possibly address in regards to your program. So like we said, it can really help to define the scope of your evaluation, and it tells you, yes, we will be addressing these types of questions, but no, we can't address these other types of questions, either because we don't have the capacity, we have limited resources, or we just don't really care. We don't really need to know about the other types right now. So at the end of the day, it forces you to almost prioritize and specify what you want out of your evaluation and what we really need to know right now. And of course, if you're doing a community-driven evaluation, you're going to be developing these questions collaboratively with all your stakeholders and your evaluators. And your questions should reflect the interests of everyone involved. And you should try to aim for open-ended questions and avoid those simple yes or no questions, just because you won't get that in-depth information that you really need. And these questions are not your survey questions. They're broader, and they're like you have less questions in your actual survey questions, but like your evaluation questions will definitely influence what type of questions you're going to ask in your survey or in your interview. They're almost like a guide to it. When it comes to generating these types of evaluation questions, like I said, you're going to want to engage a variety of stakeholders in the process. Having different stakeholders will allow you to have a whole bunch of different opinions and different points of views to include in your evaluation, and also give you lots of evaluation questions to choose from. And the strength of this is just having that diversity of perspective and the joint expertise that comes with having a whole bunch of people involved. I think it would be important to establish a norm of openness. So portraying that like open discussion is actually a good thing, and we want to hear what other people are thinking of. So listening, asking probing questions, keeping the ideas flowing, not limiting ideas would be important. So one thing that our evaluation team did to try to ease the process of generating questions was we used something called Jamboard. And there's lots of different online applications that are similar that you could use. One of them is Nearpod, I think. And basically everyone connects to it from their computer or their phone or any kind of mobile device. And everyone just starts writing up on electronic sticky notes different potential evaluation questions that you could be asking. And then each person is going to pin those sticky notes onto a huge board for everyone to see. So we took about 10 minutes to do this activity. It doesn't take too long. And once everyone is done, you have a ton of sticky notes and a lot of potential evaluation questions to choose from. And then you could discuss them as a group and then pick the ones you like best. This could also be dangerous if you have too many good questions. Don't forget that last step of like actually deciding which ones are most important and prioritizing the ones you like best and the ones you really want to address. And this type of activity is really useful if you don't really know where to start or nobody really knows what we want out of the evaluation. You should have your purpose statement, of course, but sometimes it's difficult to narrow down those specific points that you want to address. So you dive right into it, it gets the ideas flowing, and people can build off of other people's ideas. And you could also do this in real life with large poster boards. It doesn't have to be online. So just divide everyone into a group, give them a big poster board, and then everyone can just start writing evaluation questions, and then you can share it with the larger group, and then together pick the ones you like best. And yeah, it encourages a whole lot of collaboration between everyone.
Great, thanks, Janae. Yeah, so prior to COVID, we used to do this in like on a big whiteboard or whatever and post stickies. So maybe one day we'll be back to a world where we can actually see people in person. But again, failing that, like Janae said, there's lots of online tools where we can do similar types of activities where, and again, just to reiterate what Janae said, and I think that was fantastic. The key point of this is to kind of get the ideas flowing. Ideally, what we want at the end of this process is 3 to 5 high quality questions that we can use to drive our evaluation. And so again, remember, these flow from our purpose statement, right, and are related to our purpose statement. As Janae mentioned, key things you want to think of in terms of creating these evaluation questions. You want them broad enough that they're going to be able to generate interesting information, but also specific enough that they actually address the purpose of the evaluation, and so that you can actually answer them, these questions. And so I kind of like this in terms of like thinking about like a funnel in terms of this, right, where we're going from the broad purpose statement down to more specific evaluation questions, which is going to lead to the actual methods that we're going to use to gather the data, right? So our surveys, our interviews, our photo voice, whatever it is, where we actually then have the, the questions that we will ask on those particular instruments, but these are going to guide those things. And so I've got a few examples here of some evaluation questions. So the yellow one, in what ways have we made a difference, if any, could be an example of an evaluation. What is the return on investment? To what extent did we reach the intended audience? So what you'll see in each of these ones is we try to avoid the yes/no questions like Janae mentioned. Okay, they're a little bit broader than that. But then if you look at each of these questions as well, the question themselves will then help us determine how we can best answer the question, right? So if the question is, what is the return on investment? Well, this means I better gather some data that tells me something about return on investment, right? I might need to then gather some data, again, whether this is people's perspectives on the return on investment, whether I'm actually gathering financial data to be able to do this. But the question itself is going to drive the methods that I use and the ways that I gather that information. So again, I want to limit this down to about 3 to 5 questions. So how do I choose my questions? Again, going back to, and this all kind of flows, we start our theory of change, right? And from our theory of change, we derive our purpose statement. So our questions need to be consistent both with our purpose and with our theory of change, right? So if my question is, what's the return on investment? But what I'm gathering is, I don't know, people's preference in the flowers that they like in their front window. I mean, a stupid example, but essentially like what I'm saying, like these are cross purposes, like that has nothing to do with anything that I'm collecting data. And while that example might be stupid, we often do that sometimes where we've got this great question, but it doesn't actually address anything that I'm trying to answer, right? It's completely orthogonal, or it's completely, at right angles to what it is that I'm actually trying to answer. So I said, it needs to be specific enough to be answerable, but broad enough to stimulate inquiry. We need to match the resources we have. So part of this was, again, so if you don't have the resources to do like a 10-year qualitative study on people's perspectives on something, then why would you start that? I mean, it sounds great, but at the end of the day, we want this to actually be usable. And so think about the resources you have at hand. What questions can you actually answer? Right? What's actually doable with the resources that are there? So again, considering about your capacity as an individual or an organization, and also with respect from stakeholders as to for example, what's deemed to be appropriate evidence. So there's lots of ways I could answer a question on return on investment. Again, I could actually gather financial data and look and see whether or not it's had a financial impact. But I could also, from my stakeholders, say, what's actually more impactful is people's stories about how they've been impacted by this. And so the return on investment could actually be a collection of case studies of individual stories about how their lives have been changed as a result of some program. And so part of this is understanding what is appropriate evidence, what constitutes evidence within the context that I'm working. And then, pardon me, developing questions so that I can answer those types of things. So later on, when we get into things like arts-based methods, and I've kind of talked a lot about photo voice, but essentially photo voice has to do with people taking pictures of their environment based on something that we're interested in. And so if I was working, for example, with youth, I might say, tell me about your experience of growing up in Edmonton, and have them take pictures that tell the story of how they grew up in Edmonton. Very subjective, right? But again, this would address particular types of questions, but it also wouldn't let us address other questions, right? If I wanted to say something like, what's the proportion of youth in Edmonton that feel safe? Photo voice may not be the best way, or maybe it is, but it might not be the best method to be able to answer that type of question. And so part of it is, again, thinking about what do my stakeholders deem to be appropriate evidence, and then basing my questions on that. So let me give you some examples of some questions. And again, these are real questions that our Big Brothers Big Sisters group came up with as their evaluation questions. And so again, these are related to the purpose statement that they came up with. And so their questions are, what is facilitating engagement in a virtual space, and what is challenging engagement in a virtual space? Which elements of virtual mentoring are successful? which require improvements, and what have we learned, okay? And then the final one is virtual mentoring feasible in terms of resources, okay? So these are kind of where they went with their questions in terms of drawing those back to their purpose. And so again, these can be whatever questions you want. The key things here, again, that you want to remember, they should be tied to your purpose, okay? And the way that I would determine whether or not my questions are effective is just like Janae suggested, have my purpose statement there, put my evaluation questions right underneath, and each one I would say, okay, does this address my purpose? If yes, great. If no, another time, I'm going to parking lot that one, right? Does this address my purpose? Yes. And once I get down to all those questions that address my purpose, then I can start to say, okay, I'm going to prioritize these. What are the ones that I have the resources to work on right now, right? And maybe next year I'll do another one, or maybe I have the resources to do them all, and so that's great. So again, this hopefully just gives you some ideas about ways in which you can think about the resources you have at hand, think about what you want to accomplish, and then really set up a clear purpose and clear evaluation questions that allow you to kind of make that process as seamless as possible, but also keep it within the scope that is meaningful for you at this time. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Kirsty and Janelle.
All right, thanks. So today here we have Janelle with us as our sort of speaker that we always bring a speaker in to kind of bring some of the content to life. And so today we have Janelle. And so Janelle is a research associate at the Community University Partnership at the University of Alberta. And that's where we, the Evaluation Capacity Network, are also housed. And she is working on poverty-related research and evaluation in a partnership with End Poverty Edmonton. And she completed her Master of Arts in Psychology at Carleton University. And today she's going to speak to us a little bit about her experience with some of these elements in relation to her work with End Poverty Edmonton. And I'm going to stop sharing so you can share your screen here.
Sorry, just a second. Okay, did that work? I don't think so. Okay. Oh, did it?
It worked. Yeah, we can see your slides.
Okay. So hi everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Kirsty. So yeah, my name is Janelle. I work at the Community University Partnership, and I provide research and evaluation support to End Poverty Edmonton, organization that seeks to end poverty in our community in a generation by addressing 6 game changers: livable incomes, affordable housing, anti-racism, affordable and quality childcare, accessible and affordable transit, and access to health services, from a collective impact approach to bring people and stakeholders together to create unique solutions and innovations to end poverty. So we know that solving complex system-level problems such as poverty comes from solutions rather than isolated intervention of individuals. Multiple mutually reinforcing activities and initiatives to work towards their goal of ending poverty. So as a result of the structure of EPE, we don't evaluate programs, but instead we are and progress towards the goal.
Janelle, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your microphone keeps cutting out. So we've caught maybe, I think, half of that.
Okay, is that better?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I will just maybe start again. Okay, so our community partner is End Poverty Edmonton, and they're a nonprofit organization that seeks to end poverty in our community in a generation by addressing 6 game changers: livable incomes, affordable housing, anti-racism, affordable and quality childcare, accessible and affordable transit, and access to health services. EP works from a collective impact approach to bring people and stakeholders together to create solutions and innovations to end poverty. So we know that solving poverty or solving complex systems level problems such as poverty comes from cross-sector coordination and emerging solutions rather than the isolated intervention of individual organizations. So because of that, EP doesn't have programs, but instead they work on multiple mutually reinforcing activities and initiatives to end poverty. So because of that, when we talk about evaluation in this context, we're not talking about evaluating programs, but instead we're exploring the impact of an initiative and progress towards that goal of ending poverty. So what I'm going to talk about today is one of EP's initiatives and how we did evaluation within this context. So EP has a workforce development collaboration that's made up of representatives from municipal, provincial, and nonprofit organizations in Edmonton, and they provide employment supports for people who are underemployed or unemployed. So how this collaboration works is that the workforce development agencies sit at the table and industry comes to discuss the opportunities that they have for good jobs. A good job is one that pays a living wage, has benefits such as health insurance and sick time, and also provides job security. And so the purpose of this group is to work together at a systems level to reduce barriers to good jobs and to improve connections to or between workforce development agencies and the industry. Some of the industries that we've worked with is the construction industry and also the ironworking trade. So systems in this case refers specifically to the context and systems that impact poverty. So we're thinking about the programs and policies and fundings that is shaped by government policies like federal, provincial, and municipal, employer and union interests, and the workforce development organizations. So given all of that context, today I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluating the design and the implementation of this collaboration and why it's important to the overall goal of improving access to good jobs for people experiencing poverty. First, I'm going to go over what we learned about collaboration, how we learned it, and why we decided to do this evaluation the way that we did. And so when considering the evaluation, we knew that for many reasons, the capacity of EPE and the members of our collaborative group was pretty limited. It was the summer, we were in the process of planning a research project that was going to tell us more about the general workforce development system in Edmonton, and we needed the knowledge that was going to come from the research project. As a result, because we did still have evaluation questions that we wanted answers, we decided to embed a developmental evaluation within the existing project that we were planning, specifically a project where we combined research and evaluation to learn more about the workforce development system in Edmonton, as well as specifically the collaboration that we were doing. So for the evaluation component, we chose to focus on a really small portion of the work that could inform the strategic direction of the group. So when thinking about the evaluation purpose, some of the things that we considered were what are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve? What is the purpose of these questions and what do we want to do with this information? We knew that the purpose of the overall research project, so thinking about the whole system of workforce development in Edmonton, was to guide policy and system change efforts of End Poverty Edmonton in workforce development. But the purpose of the evaluation, we decided, was to assess the collaboration and partnerships within the group to understand group dynamics, barriers to collaboration, and the benefits to collaboration and being a part of this group. So we were thinking about how we could use the results of the evaluation to adapt and improve the work that the group was doing and to also inform the future direction with what we've learned. So in terms of thinking about the evaluation question specifically, the overarching question for the whole game changer of livable incomes and workforce development is bringing workforce development agencies and industries together, an effective way to increase employment opportunities for people experiencing poverty. And that just unfortunately was way too big of a scope. And so what we did, like I mentioned before, was focus on specifically collaboration. So the questions that informed this portion of the work centered around, to what extent is the collaboration learning to work together? What are some of the barriers of collaboration? What are the facilitators of collaboration, and how is collaborating helping us work towards that overall goal of ending poverty? So what we wanted to do was look at how the group was working together, what they were struggling with, what is not going well, and not that overall goal of getting people good jobs. So there was a lot of decisions that we had to make about the evaluation question and analysis of the results. A lot of those, or all of those decisions, were made in partnership with End Poverty Edmonton, specifically their evaluation specialist and the person leading the workforce development table. But we all really came to it with different objectives, experience, and knowledge. So it took a lot of time to navigate the different needs of wanting to conduct this large scale evaluation, thinking about where the table was at, and then also thinking about our desire to learn more in the context of research. So it took us a bit of time to navigate that process, but we did eventually decide that what we were going to do is look only at the collaboration and not answer any of our other evaluation questions. And there were a few reasons that we made that decision. So the first one was that it reduced the burden on the members of the collaboration. So instead of conducting a pretty intensive like interview, surveys, research project, and also doing that with evaluation, putting them together meant that we weren't doing that with a fairly new group. So at the time of the interviews, the group had been working together for about 8 months, which is a fairly short amount of time for a collective impact initiative and for a group to figure out how to coordinate their efforts or to make significant changes at the system level. So instead, they spent time learning how to do the work, how to work together, and what they wanted their goals to be. So another thing that we considered in this was how do we make sure that the findings from our evaluation questions are going to be usable? So we decided that we were going to conduct interviews with the group members and have those interviews add to the knowledge that we were gaining through other methods like monitoring. And we chose to do the analysis with a representative of EPE, my supervisor at the U of A, and myself, instead of having it be a more participatory analysis with the members of the workforce development collaboration. And we chose to do that because a lot of the members of the group work in the nonprofit sector and do this work off the side of their desk. And so instead, we chose to engage in member checking during a regular meeting that was scheduled to determine if the results fit with their understanding of how the group was working together. So what did we learn? We really did learn a lot about the story of this work and how the group was collaborating together. Specifically, we learned a lot about what wasn't working and the constraints and context, and how the constraints and context were shaping what we were doing. So specifically, what we learned is that the jobs that were brought forward by the industries that we were working with were mostly construction and labor jobs and not easily accessible to the clients of the collaboration members. We also learned that the funding system makes it really difficult to work together. It fosters competition instead of collaboration, especially between agencies. And so when all of our members are from different agencies, even though they're working together in this context, they are also competing for funding. And so that creates a really interesting dynamic when you think about working together, because the success of the collaboration in a lot of ways can't come before the success of an individual organization. Yeah, another really interesting finding was that a lot of organizations are funded for program success, not success at the systems level. So they're rewarded with new funding often if they meet their deliverables. And those deliverables are at a program level, not a systems level. And so because everyone is working on that program level, it's really difficult to work at the systems level off the side of your desk. And so what was really important about what we learned from this evaluation is something that happened at a meeting a few months before we had the results of the analysis. And so while we were working and learning through this project, we were also continuing to meet as a group. And at one meeting, we talked about the number of job opportunities that industry had brought to the table and compared that number to the number of jobs placements that had been filled by these workforce development agencies. And the number was quite low, a lot lower than what we would have expected. And I think that one of the reasons that having the results of the evaluation later was so meaningful was because without evaluating the collaboration, we wouldn't have known potentially why what we were doing wasn't working and how we can move forward. So it could have been really defeating, but instead, because we were doing this evaluation at the same time, we had a lot of those answers. And so, yeah, we kind of knew a little bit of the answer of why this wasn't working. We learned a lot about what barriers exist to our success. We learned that while we haven't achieved success at the system level, we know a lot more about how we can adapt and improve, and the results of this evaluation are going to inform the strategic planning and future work of this group. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Janelle. I think that was a really great example of the way that these concepts apply to actual work. And I really liked your point about like that question we started with was way too broad because that can happen, right? And I think that's part of the great things about evaluation is it's so iterative and requires a lot of sometimes it feels like backtracking, but you are making progress. And so thanks for sharing. I see we have a few questions as well in the Q&A now, so I'm going to pass it off to Jason to answer those before we sort of start to wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So thanks for the questions, and thanks Janelle as well. I just want to echo Kirsty's comments. Thanks for being willing to come in and provide some actual real life examples, which I think helps put things in context and moves us from kind of the theory to what actually takes place in real life. So there's two questions in there, both kind of related, having to do with the questions. So I'll address the first one. So the question is, from your examples, seeing that all the questions are open-ended, it's good to get detail about it, but I feel it'd be overwhelming to process and analyze data collected from many respondents. Absolutely. And so there's a couple things I want to address with that. So on one level, so what we're talking about here in this particular lecture is the evaluation questions, which kind of organize and drive your evaluation. So these aren't necessarily the ones that you'll use to, ask participants to fill out, like on a survey or an interview or stuff like that. And so, for example, I might have like as the objective or my evaluation question, to what extent are we achieving our organizational objectives? Could be my evaluation question. But then I might, in order to answer that, I might say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up with a survey with 20 questions that look at my organizational objectives, right? Objective 1, and then give people a Likert scale, right? To what degree are we achieving objective 1? Like not at all to a lot or something like that, right? So even though my evaluation question is open-ended, the way that I go about getting that answered it could be completely different in that case, right? And so it might make sense, again, considering resources or in terms of how easy it is to answer the question, to use closed-ended survey to be able to answer that one. And then that feeds into the second question. If you're making a number of questions, again, we're only talking here about the evaluation questions. It's sort of like the, underneath the purpose statement, those large sort of higher level questions that drive the evaluation. Now, to answer those, you might need like 30 questions on a survey or 10 questions on an interview to be able to address those higher level questions. So absolutely, right? I'm not in any way suggesting that you should only have a 3-question survey or anything like that. I mean, if you could, that'd be great, but likely you're going to probably need more of those questions to address whatever evaluation questions you have, and then to actually meet the purpose and goals of your evaluation. So hopefully that addressed those questions. If you want to follow up, just let me know. I'm happy to provide more examples or thoughts.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And I think too, like, it kind of makes me think of Janae's comment where it's like your purpose is like your title, your questions are like your subtitles, and then your surveys, your interviews, whatever, your photo voice, whatever you're using to answer those questions to collect the data, that's kind of like your text underneath, I guess. So that might be usually when if you see a essay, you'll see a lot more text than you would subheadings, right? And so you might have more interview questions that gather more specific details than you would in your subheading. You're not going to describe everything with your subheading that you're going to talk about. So yeah, with that, I will also add that if you do have more questions about any of the content, please feel free to reach out. One of the ways you can do that is through accessing our coaching. So what I'm going to do now actually is just go over the resources available to you guys, including the Moodle site and the coaching, just as a refresher. But before I do that, I just want to say, I think there's some new names here. So if this is your first pre-eval webinar, what we're asking is that you complete this survey, which I'm going to pop in the chat right here. If you could click it and open it, and then you can do it later. It shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes. This is just our way of evaluating these pre-eval webinars, essentially. And so we ask people to do them when they attend their first pre-eval or watch their first pre-eval webinar, and then we'll ask you to do it after you've completed all 8. And that'll help us understand if we're actually, making a difference and meeting your guys' needs in regards to learnings about evaluation. So if this is your first one, please go ahead, click that link that's in the chat, open it up, and then you can complete that later. The second thing is if this is your first pre-eval, if you do watch all 8, you will get a certificate of completion. If you attend them live, we can do that automatically. Otherwise, there'll be an option for you to apply to it once we're all done. But if you've then missed the first 4, you'll need to access those to watch. So where you can do that is at our Moodle site. So I'm just going to show you guys really quick our Moodle site again as a refresher on how to actually access the webinars for people who maybe have registered for the Moodle site but haven't actually gone. So you'll go to eval.albertamentors.ca and you'll go through there and you'll see this page, which looks really blank, but if you click login at the top, here you can go to either log in if you've already created this, or create an account. Once you've created your account and you've logged in and you've verified everything, you'll need to click on this and register yourself in the course to actually see it. That might be a step that you've missed if you've registered for the website but haven't enrolled yourself in the course. It's a really quick step. After you've enrolled yourself, when you click this, you'll get all of our content that we have so far, which includes some discussion boards, websites, some samples that we have, as well as links to coaching, and links to the survey that I put there and the actual webinar. So if you click on webinar recordings, right now, the way it's set up is that you'll see the first webinar. If you've already seen it, you can just press continue and hit submit. And you can go that all the way through until you've watched all the ones that you want to see. The setup might change. It might just move to be a scrolling sort of process. But right now, this is how it's set up. And so you'll see you can access all of the different webinars that we have done so far. This one will probably be posted next week. So yeah, that's how you can access the pre-eval webinars. The second piece I want to show you and remind you is coaching. So if you are an Alberta Mentoring Partnership organizational partner, you can actually access an hour of free individualized coaching where you can ask questions about pre-eval. You could bring your own evaluation that you maybe need some help with, your evaluation plan that you need some help with. You could bring data that you want some help analyzing. You could bring an evaluation question that you need to make more specific. Anything under the sun with evaluation you can bring here. If you're not sure if you're a partner, there's a link there should be a link. Here it is. Clicking this link here, you can go and look if you're a partner or register to become a partner. And otherwise, you can click this link here and just sign up for your coaching session there, and we'll get in touch and set up your free coaching session. So yeah, please use that. There's also question and answer portals if you do have questions, prefer to do that. So lots of great stuff on here. It's just going to keep growing. So I encourage you to go to this website and register. And then the last thing I'm going to plug is that we are collecting all of this data on to evaluate this, but we'd also like, if you're comfortable, for you to review this sort of consent form that we have here to participate in our study of it. So this just means that we're not using your data without your consent. And so I will post the link here where you can read the consent form and fill it out. And that will allow us to use your data to learn a little bit more about how we're building evaluation capacity through this pre-eval series. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to sort of pop them in the chat now, or otherwise, I think we'll see you again. The registration's open for the last 3 pre-evals, the same place you registered before, the albertamentors.ca website /eval. And we will see you in March. Thanks for coming, everybody. Take care.